Hi, I am Denisio Matringa as Prave Rokin, Prevent from Flow. And today I wish to get into the Nag Hammadi Scriptures and more so break down on the origin of the world. Um, but I want to go into something else. So about a year ago, before I got into, way before I got into the Nag Hammadi Scriptures, and I was learning into certain sciences and spirituality, and coming onto this path. Um, I was breaking down just having um, uh, I was told like as they were called as epiphanies or visions. It's not necessarily that I'm seeing things. I'm more cognizing things, and it gives a very visual representation. And I feel that is very analogous to the story of on the origin of the world and some uh, perspectives of how you can see certain concepts. And I want to break this down, and then I want to correlate to that to the origin on the origin of the world, and then I want to break down on the origin of the world. So here we go. Um, Essentially, for the moon cycle, it is the first quarter moon, and so this is when you put your energy in and all that fun jazz, and you're essentially going to start getting resistance, and that way you can start. It's like uh, don't cast your pearls before swine, right? Like the pearls are essentially like dirt, and they get into clams, right? And then there's pressure, and they turn into pearls. Same thing with diamonds, as you know, with that whole scenario. And so, don't cast your jewels before swine. Um, it's it's like working to make it a jewel instead of giving it away right away before it is a jewel. Um, in this sense, not like it's in the creation place, and then once you have the jewel, then don't uh, cast your jewels before this one. But let's get right into it. Okay, so to break this down, um, I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'll go along with it and explain it. So it says, I was in physics today, and yeah, so all these epiphanies I uh, correlated with my physics teacher from my understanding and from what I grasped around like a bunch of different things that I was researching at the time, but um, it did not pertain to one thing or another per se, but just a world that revolved around this understanding that I came to create, but also explore. And so, yeah, and so this is how it went. I was in physics today, and I learned about the interactions of waves. After explaining the applicability of consciousness within one of the two types, electromagnetic and the other spectrum, she explained how they both apply to, or how it applies to both the mechanical and the electromagnetical types. And yeah, it paradoxes out because um, essentially it applies to both, but it also applies to neither. Essentially, consciousness. That's what scientists have come to understand, and and so it's kind of almost inexplicable. But those two types in metaphysics um, paradox in relation to nothing, and so that's what I was saying. And so um, thus, it said, because of this, I had reached a point to where it led me to ponder and return. And then upon returning, I realized that this paradoxation between consciousness and nothing can be seen as a default for one, right? So it's like nothingness, somethingness, default, right? And the default would be consciousness. And so it's saying that because consciousness is like a layer already in things, as you understand, like animism or other forms of understanding, or even like the gods that are correlated to certain planets, like you could represent them as the consciousness of the planets themselves, which is one way I see it. um, that essentially that consciousness as being a default and being the virtue of a paradox, that it makes these both defaults also equivalent to each other at the same time, and also non-equivalent because they're paradoxes. And that is the process of transmutation in the all, you know. And so for one and thus the other, a default for one and thus the other. And since already explaining that we should evolve to become more energetic in structure, so what I was getting to that is essentially, and thus less dense, is that the density, right? When you have a solid, the processing between those things, if you notice, like, say they're right against each other, right? Okay, then you move, it's like simultaneous, right? And so when there's a space, like say it's a liquid, right? Then you have to get there, and then you get there, and then you get the reaction. And if it's a gas, it's even longer space, right? So when you are at a solid and it's so dense, right, in that simultaneousness, the less dense you are, or yeah, I believe so. That's correct. Yeah, less dense. That the simultaneousness, right? Simultaneousness becomes more simultaneous, right? So instead of like 5 seconds, it'd be like 0.5 seconds or something like that. Just a correlation to, it's like infinity math in a sense, and it also relates to the processing of the mind. It's very interesting. And so essentially, yeah, and thus we would have to have systems of functionality, like our body, like organs and whatnot, that contain and use consciousness in response to a judgment or a feeling implied by the system of function. So what I was stating before I realized it is essentially, the consciousness within you, the innate system of the body that like works with tinctures and all that fun jazz. That essentially, when it's exactly like how you create your own reality, right? So when you picture something, right, it's not going to be like, say if it's money, it's not going to be like, oh, you having a bunch of money and being all happy and tossing the money around and bathing in it. No, because what is attached to that is exactly the state you're in now, is that you don't have it, and that's why you either won't get it or there will be loss because of that visualization. And so you will picture it and say, like, picture a bunch more, and then picture what you can do with it, but also being just as happy as you are now. So it's kind of like a neutral state, but still being more thankful and more glad to the universe, and then putting all these emotions and all these passions into it, that judgment or feeling, right, into that function, to where you can attract that, right? Sort of that mind over matter kind of thing. That's just an example. And so I said, such a thing in the world of potentials, and the expansion of all, because the world that is expanding would have to contain a predecessor function, because in the notion of evolution, it only evolves to that point from like a function having a potential of action, right? Like different ways it can do things, right? So like there's one way, there's another way, like emotions. But then say for those emotions of that function, right, that there is characteristics of that come to be. So how like animals can love, right? They say that we evolved from apes. I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying that's false. I'm just saying that that gives rise to consciousness, and the awareness of love is that on that scale of frequency, and also has to do with less density, is that fear is down here and love's down here. Reptiles fear and have all these things. They don't really have love. Like only certain species, such as apes and some others, mammals and whatnot, can love. And then you get to that point where there's consciousness, and so that's where it's like, you don't really understand, like, that you're, like, if you're an ape, you don't understand that you're hurting them, like so much, right? Like you see the ape that is just getting played around with. You start messing with the ape, it starts messing with you back, and then it starts beating you, and it doesn't know that you're hurt until you're dead. That kind of thing. It's exactly that. It has love. It doesn't have empathy. It doesn't, know to sympathize and all these fun things. So yeah, would have to contain a predecessor function towards that already containing the function. This is where I referred to the placebo effect, and the consciousness and self are separated but in union. So essentially, like you see the placebo effect is that you tell yourself something will happen, right? Or you tell yourself like something is, and then you make an action or just act upon that, and your body responds because you tell yourself or you convince yourself on any sort of level that it is, and the action, because think of it like evolution. Why would we act on things in a certain way if if it wasn't that case, right? If there wasn't a certain thing lining up to that. So if we convince our mind enough, and then we act on it, or act on it in a certain way that that it convinces the body of that function and compensates. And that's like sort of like a voodoo magic, whatever. It's like the sugar cube experiment. You tell them that it's a Tylenol or anything, right? Give them a freaking sugar cube. It'll take their pain away. That's just because, it's exactly what they want. They believe it. All right, take it. And they're expecting it, and the expectation is fulfilled because they put an action upon it, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of funny. But that's where, it has to do with the will and the consciousness, the awareness, right? And the will, right? And being aware of that plays a part of like, the consciousness or the awareness and the will, and then being aware of the two functions. So like them in like a box, right? You're being aware that compounds it, right? And then if that compounds it more, and then that's when, you act upon it, then it's like it's a paradox. That's what I've been getting into, right? So like facets and fractals are like paradoxes, as well as and so and the consciousness and the self are separated but in union, and the self in relation to the paradox would be the cause of the actionability in the nothing default, and thus the cause of the placebo, placebo, which in the paradox of us, of humans, is the action from the potential of the structure, right? The action of the potential in the structure, right? And so, and your mind is paradox to the body. That's just kind of a given of the nothing, of the structure of the nothing, and is caused by will. Thus, the will is the self and is separate but united with consciousness. This truly separates the structure, the body, and the consciousness, the spirit, right? It flows through all, to thus exemplify the notion that the will is the will of what you would call a God. And I'm going to get to that. I'm going to break that down. I'm not saying the Christian God. I'm not putting a label onto it. So please do not assume, but that is, I believe that, it's all telling the same story, no matter what religion. Just the label of God is, a matter of choice onto which mental structure they wish to put it on. And so that's what I'm going to get to in this. So don't put a preference to that. And so I said Father, making it, showing the Trinity within it. And then, but is represented in the way we work with things, working and interacting with the things we have, and also on the things we have, yeah. And so like, which is more like intent, which I'll get into. Thus, the true Trinity is in the will, the action, but more so, yeah. But as it is one Trinity, when paradoxed out, it needs to be in one. So what I mean by that is that okay, so if you have the will, the structure, and then your representation mentally of what a god or what God is you, which is what the part I was going to get to, is if there's some sort of structure in your understanding or anything that has control or power over you or has made you make an action or whatever, then different than otherwise if you didn't let it godize you, as a god over you, that that is a god besides any mental construct because you put it over you in the way you do. Get that? Okay. It's like giving your power away. Thus, the true Trinity is in the will, but as it is one Trinity, when paradoxed out, it needs to be in one. So because of fractals, the will, the structure, and then the God representation, when it fractals out, the will is going to still have the will within it, but it's also going to have the structure, and it's going to have the Trinity. But those are going to be tainted to be under the subjective control of whatever the top facet is within this structure. It is the will. And so say this was the Trinity, those would be under or not the Trinity. Say this is the representation of what God is to you, then yeah, there's that. And then the self, which is technically not corrupted or anything, then because the self is technically the only thing you have, and so it's like at birth and everything, so it's the only thing that's pure, and then all these things would be subjected to that. And so there's that understanding. Thus the work on/in things, like working on things and giving our intent with our body, is the body. So we work on things physically, or we put our intent in the interaction of those things, that is the body that has relation to the structure, or the body within the Trinity is what I'm referring to. And work on/in our bodies with things, right? Working on ourselves, or giving intent from the cognitive actualization onto ourselves because of things, is the spirit, right? And so, and if you don't contain God, you must build to over encompass the structure represented so that you can implement the full you, the full self, right? Whatever the intent is, if it's the highest self of all, the highest good, then you will over encompass to make that structure, and you will learn for yourself if that is your goal. Otherwise, you could just sheeple yourself away. Or the more possibilities, and allows the potential to expand. Thus why many religious are lost, and many scientists can hold morality without truly being so. Because what is morality if there is a structure of the Most High, right? That wouldn't it be the process of transmutation itself, which we see in the Nag Hammadi Scriptures and all these things, right? It's from nothing to something. That's an incorporated incorporation, separating the lack, making lack have a lack of lack. So there's a lack system and an incorporation system, right? Like fear and like love, right? And that's pretty basic. That's all it comes down to. Backtracking to the expansion and the potentials of the expansion. And since it is nothing, and since it being nothing, and all potentials come from that nothing, then the potential of the representation of consciousness. Since it is nothing, right? Since like expansion and the potentials, right, are of this nothingness, like, right? and all potentials come from that aether. Then the potential, like what your representation of consciousness can potentially be, um, whether by the structure itself or by working, or the working we hold so, like the expression that we continually emphasize and also build upon, right? Yeah, so either the physical representation of that consciousness stream or the mental representation of that consciousness stream, the software or the hardware of that thing that flows through us, um, are just as infinite in their expansion of self as the potentiality. So what I mean by that is, like, um, essentially, you know, um, your that mental representation of that thing within us, that consciousness, is just as expansive as the potential, which is potentiality itself, right? So that aether somethingness, right? The potentiality that comes into a consciousness figment into the somethingness, right? It's a potential all the way. And that even within that somethingness, as it's still in a state of becoming, there is things feeding that, right? And then feeding that, right? And then feeding that, just over encompassing it, right? That kind of thing. And so it the representation of consciousness, because it is um, the middle ground, right? And it makes us in this equilibrium at this, apex within this the structure of uh, the ecosystem and of our world and whatnot. That at that equilibrium, right? Because we're at this top, it makes that balance that because we're at this top and there's all this nothingness, that we're at this middle ground and that we're actually at the neutral state. So there's some wiggle room and all that fun jazz. And so that's why we work in waves. That's an exact representation of why, or at least one, and so yeah, it is what it is. And so, like, you are born, right, blank slate, even though you are pure, right, in this your soul is pure, right, as we know. And so you go from the stage of nothingness into somethingness, and there's parts of somethingness and nothingness all the way. And that no matter how fulfilled you come in your understanding of things, um, because potentials seemingly build as you expand your knowledge base and how that makes you you, that um, that is like beyond a gift if you think about it, because that's what our mind does with the thing that's in us, coursing through us, that's already coursing through the all, right? But all these other things do it over a long period of time, over generations. That's a gift, right? All right. And I might actually have to do the Nag Hammadi Scriptures on a second video. In that case, I'll do it at the end, where I'll go over it and then I'll notify it again. But yeah, and then afterwards start up on them, just so saving time and all that fun jazz. Okay, and so um, okay, so I said. Potential comes from nothing. Then the potentiality of the representation of consciousness, whether by the structure itself or the working we hold so, are just as infinite in their expansion of self as the potentiality. From this, you can only see that the other part, also, as it contains the self, and thus the Trinity, it has to be, God itself, or the structure in which you represent as God, or um, this sort of personality or whatever, And I say this for you to realize what made God eyes you, and vice versa, what you made God eyes. And thus is the only way to expand the whole as whole. and I'm going to leave it as that. Oh, okay. So I wrote this speaking about what I proved, only because I only had so much time, so I needed to get back to that. And so okay, so I proved to Miss Bedwell that the sense of the universe is analogous, or the sense that since the universe is analogous to consciousness and expands, so can consciousness, and the rate is open. So I'm going to explain this. Okay, so if you understand that the universe is always in a state of expansion and motion, right? It's almost like a quantum expanding. Like the Big Bang, it's still happening, right? And it's still expanding. And so time is just a bubble, but if you're outside the bubble, it's just the same size, and it always will be, right? It's a trip. It's a trip. But that's just one tiny aspect of it, right? If you think of all the galaxies over a period of time, this merging of galaxies as analogous in the representation of that, right? You have to see this over a period of billions or millions and billions of years, right? And so time is applied in this representation of space, right? Space time, right? Going beyond the 3D, that is analogous to the neurons in your brain. Okay, and so if you see that, that plays a role in the macrocosm and microcosm, right? That if consciousness is going through that, right, and you see that over a period of time, then you see a continual flow of energy flowing through the structure that is analogous to a system of already being of space and time. That one thing aspect of the Emerald Tablets that I think is the space time is that itself. And I feel that I'm going to go and break that down into another video, the Emerald Tablets, into consciousness, unconsciousness, and subconsciousness, and other facets of things, because I feel that these other people have it spot on. I just, from my understanding of things, I think that it's a matter of perspective. And that's what I wish to break down, is this perspective that I see theirs, and I came to theirs after I reread it, but I read that before I got into the Nag Hammadi Scriptures, and so it correlated back into a lot of understandings of things that I found interesting, and I wrote in my book. And so I wouldn't say like, it's my book, it's just my journal. And so I um, I would very much like to go over that because I think it is interesting, and it very much is shedding light to see all these kinds of perspectives. It's exciting. Um, and so how this portrays to essentially, oh, I didn't even finish this up. Um, so, okay, so it's analogous to consciousness and expands. So can consciousness, and the rate is open. And then prove that cycles and potentials are intimate in the relationship of the whole, right? So potentials are the expressions of things, right, as what it can be like in a future relation, right? And the cycles are what it is, as well as what it can do, right? Like, so what it is as a whole, right? Like the body, and then what it can do, all these functions, all these organs, right? And then, right, so potentials play a part in that. Like, so if there is a certain action, right, that it is trying to come for, that in action, all these actions that it already has contain a number of potentials, a perspective potentials, right? And in relation to all the other things working around it, like all the other functions in relation to each other, it also takes down potentials, but also increases the potentials based on the relations. So what it can be is based off of that, the relations, right? And so that's why I believe that this sort of intimate relationship is like Sophia and um, I wouldn't say Yaldabaoth, but man, like I believe that man was kind of stepping stone for Yaldabaoth and them to kind of have Sophia come down and make some sort of purification to take out, that which is pure out of Yaldabaoth and all this. And that's why I believe that we have a part in this, that all this action is put into it, all this so much from the heavens, right? Just for this world, just to purify Yaldabaoth. That's like a great gift. It was still Sophia's mistake, and that's why technically Sophia is that wisdom, is that Pisces Sophia or whatever. Sorry, Pisces is forethought, so wisdom and forethought into things. That consciousness stream, that space time, right? That it's much more. It's that spirit, but still way more. That's why she's in this as a facet, as a fractal within a lot of this, and so I think it is just very interesting that that we can kind of see that, and then also that that what it means for the part we play. Like, if you think about it, we're in a state of this 3D, right? And if we came down from so above, right, to elevate this level, elevate this state, right? What it is it's to get within a number of lifetimes, a number of generations, which our generations are obviously less than, all these beings that are considered and known to be above us, that essentially, we can get from, this third to fifth dimension to 12th dimension in a matter of a few generations if we apex to right, which we're heading there. We obviously are. I mean, but that's all it comes down to. And I'm just glad that I can read this to you and portray this to you. I'm going to get back on the Nag Hammadi texts and on the origin of the world and break that down. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you, YouTube. Oh, comment, like, and subscribe. Have a good one.